the Middle East Institute is very pleased to convene this expert panel titled The Biden Administration National Cybersecurity Strategy, Opportunities and Challenges. My name is Mohammed Sulaiman, and I'm the director of the program. I'm very excited to be moderating today's discussion, which will explore the ways in which the US cybersecurity strategy has already impacted countries in the Middle East, and specifically their relationships with the United States. We will talk about how the US has fancied its traditional regional posture on one hand, and the importance of fostering strong cyber partnerships in the Middle East on the other hand. We will tackle important questions such as whether the US cybersecurity strategy has resulted in greater cybersecurity cooperation within the region in the wake of the October 7th attacks and the related increase in disruptive cyber attacks. We will dive deep into all of these questions and more shortly. Our panel today consists of three esteemed panelists. First off, let me start by introducing our colleague, Yixia Shafi, who is a non-resident scholar with the Middle East Institute of Strategic Technology and Cybersecurity Strategy. She focuses on policy and national security implications of critical technologies such as AI, quantum, innovation, cybersecurity. We're also joined by our other colleague, Naranjan Shankar, who's also a non-resident scholar with the technology program here at MEI. He focuses on great power rivalry, technology and cybersecurity policy, and US foreign policy in Greater Middle East. And finally, we should be joined later by John Hauser, who is a principal at Ernst & Young, specialized in cyber due diligence for both private equity and strategic clients. While at Ernst & Young, he has primary focus on cyber due diligence of transactions in the private sector. Prior to joining EY, Mr. Hauser worked as a special agent with the FBI and then as assistant United States attorney. Thank you again to our panelists, to you, our audience, for joining us today. I'm going to start by having some prepared questions for our panelists. And please, if you have any questions, feel free to add them on the Zoom chat. I'm going to start with Naranjan. Based on the report you have authored for MEI before about the US cybersecurity strategy, what are the main takeaways and trends that you see in the strategy, and how does it compare to the cybersecurity strategies of previous administrations?
So first, thanks a lot for having me on this panel, Mohammed. I'm very excited for this opportunity to be talking about the Biden administration cybersecurity strategy and unpacking some of the points in the report that you mentioned that I authored back in February. So first, I'd start off by just highlighting the significance in the first place of having a national cybersecurity strategy, something that parallels the national defense strategy or the national security strategy. And moreover, that's also distinct from the Pentagon cyber strategy. And also the fact that the White House has an implementation plan that it's continuously revisiting and updating, as they recently did with the version 2.0. I really think that highlights the administration's recognition of the growing threats towards the US digital landscape and its commitment to tackling these challenges. So in terms of the strategy itself, in a lot of ways, it builds off of some of the efforts of the Trump administration and to some extent even the Obama administration. So for instance, the strategy embraces defend forward and persistent engagement operations. That was primarily initiated by Cybercom under the Trump administration. So disrupting malicious actors before they can attack US networks. So incorporating the Trump administration's more offensive and proactive cyber posture. Another important objective that the strategy lays out is accelerating the federal government's technological modernization efforts. So adoption of cloud computing platforms and also updating legacy architecture and migrating to zero trust frameworks instead. The strategy also really stresses the importance of collaboration and intelligence sharing. So obviously between governments and the private sector. So really scaling those collaborations, but also augmenting cyber partnerships on a global level as well. And one really important thing I think the strategy gets right here is that it specifically embraces a multi-stakeholder model of collaboration for protecting cyberspace and promoting international cyber norms. So collaborating with civil society, academia, NGOs as part of this broader struggle. In terms of where the 2023 strategy really stands out and differs from those of previous administrations, I think one major difference here is that it takes a more regulatory approach to cybersecurity. So advocating cybersecurity mandates across critical infrastructure sectors, and also something that stirred a lot of controversy when the strategy was first published was the call to shift liability for cyber incidents onto the private sector, onto software vendors. I'd also say, especially in comparison to the Trump administration, there was a lot more emphasis on like the values-based dimension of cyber diplomacy. So a lot of mentions of protecting digital freedoms, fighting digital authoritarianism, and really underscoring this idea of partnering with quote unquote like-minded countries. And explicitly alluding to initiatives like the Declaration for the Future of the Internet and the Freedom Online Coalition. And another related aspect that you didn't see highlighted as much, but I think is still pretty important, was the issue of it was the fact that it addressed the issue of data privacy and protection, and calling out the lack of a comprehensive national data privacy law in the US, though we have seen some recent efforts to push towards that. So in general, just to sum up, and the conclusion that I more or less drew in the report as well, is that while the strategy lays out a lot of bold initiatives and has a very transformative and ambitious agenda, and in my opinion is overall on the correct track, there's still various political and budgetary factors that can impede the realization of some of these objectives, like backlash from politicians and industry groups. But there are also international realities and broader geopolitical trends that could affect the administration's global priorities as well.
No, thank you. This is excellent. Elise, I'm going to ask you actually a very tough question. I mean, to the general public, it's very basic, but actually it's a very important one. What's the difference between the National Cybersecurity Strategy and the Pentagon Cybersecurity Strategy? Like how they relate to each other? Which one is the foundational policy of the United States government today? And additionally, beyond the Pentagon, what are the most important agency-specific plans like CISA and other agencies in the U.S. government?
Thanks, Mohammed, for this, and really pleased to be part of this panel with both Naranjan and John. This panel is actually really great timing because there's been a lot of announcements this week at the RSA Cybersecurity Conference, and the Biden administration has taken hold on promoting a lot of momentum on cybersecurity policy. So lots to cover down today. Naranjan did a great job outlining some of the main themes from the National Cybersecurity Strategy, which oversees and encompasses all of the agency's efforts. So while there are differences with the Pentagon and CISA and other agencies, they do all complement two main pillars, which one is, to Naranjan's point, technology reformation and regulations, and then software liability. There is a growing and fast shift from taking away risk and implication from the consumer to the private sector. So the Defense Innovation Base, which we often like to use as an acronym, DIB, has become a critical partner to national security and to the life of day-to-day citizens. And so when they're developing software and selling their products, not only to the public, but to the federal government, there is this growing pressure to implement specific security and cybersecurity tools to ensure the second pillar, which is resilience, security, and recovery. And so the DoD's cybersecurity strategy, which has had multiple variations, the Trump administration released one in 2018, and they just updated theirs in 2023. The shift, you can see the shift in resilience and security and forward-leaning offensive cybersecurity operations. And by offensive, we mean not only to protect and secure our own internal network, but to also being able to target and undermine ransomware and malicious cybersecurity actors from the international perspective. And so the Department of Defense cybersecurity strategy really hones on intelligence gathering, integrating new technologies and investments into new tools such as post-quantum cryptography, zero trust approach, which is not only just a security measure, but also a value-based system, and also cyber resilience for the joint force. So really increasing your digital workforce, talent pool, and also standards and means. And so those new strategy really focuses on taking stock at specific threats by adversaries and being able to target those and undermine their efforts, but also to be able to reinforce existing networks. Something that we have seen is that Cyber Command had freer reins under the Trump administration, now has a greater authority and greater resources to execute, but they're also really focused on safety and ethical implementation of some of those tools to be able to really protect valuable assets. On the Department of Homeland Security and CISA, given their purview, they're a lot more focused on the recovery and resilience piece of the pillars, which is to really protect critical infrastructure and work with the DIB and international partners to ensure that there are unified norms and standards that can be executed. Something that has built up to this week and will continue to build up is the pressure to implement and execute on software regulations. These will take time to be implemented. So a lot of the tools and guidance that we have today in the strategies are recommendations. They're not actually implementable. So Secure by Design is a recommendation. It's a new approach, but has not been executed by law. And so something really exciting that we saw this week is 60 big technology companies pledged 7 new cybersecurity principles to submit to Secure by Design approach, which tells you a lot that they didn't wait for an actual regulations to be implemented to then do the investment and then pledge their efforts. They did it pre-execution effort. So it definitely signals that the DIB and the private sector recognizes that they're a partner in here in this situation. And it also inspires international efforts. And so the last piece is the Department of State just released their international cybersecurity strategy this week, and they focus on digital solidarity and governance for critical tech. So again, technology regulation and the liability reform. And so here they're really focused on securing critical infrastructure internationally because those goods and services are so critical to day-to-day lives and economy. It's not just a national security concern. And also unified cyber norms with international partners. And so that is really exciting to see that it's a shift from the Trump administration with America first. Now it's allies and partners all matter to this ecosystem, and it will continue to be prevalent regardless of the election, regardless of the changing issues internationally. And so the unified focus and solidarity focus is definitely a prominent theme throughout all of these strategies.
This is very comprehensive. John, very happy to have you with us. I know you're on holiday, so apologies for you to joining us while you're trying to relax. Building on the excellent lay of the land that Naranjan and Alicia laid out for us, the question I have for you is, what are the broader opportunities and challenges for the Biden team now, but also if they get reelected in November?
Yeah, and thank you again for having me on the panel. Happy to take a break from the Mexico sun, where my skin doesn't really. My skin knows it's not good for me to be out there for too long, so this is perfect. Yeah, so some of the opportunities are some of the themes that I think that Naranjan and Alicia already touched on, but I can just reemphasize, which is that I think there's some pretty broad consensus about what needs to be done amongst policymakers. Cybersecurity is more of a bipartisan issue than you see in terms of a lot of other issues, and recognition about the level of the threat and who our adversaries are. And so that just makes it easier to obtain resources and for the branches of government to work together, especially Congress, which is very, very polarized. And it's tough to get legislation through. It's easier to do that in a cybersecurity context. I think there is a growing recognition about some of the things that Alicia and Naranjan mentioned about the need to push responsibility up to software providers rather than asking companies or individuals to keep patching software that's inherently insecure and remains vulnerable, that it makes more sense to push software security standards onto the developers to make it more secure before it hits the market, or to have the internet service providers, provide more secure protocols for emails and things like that, rather than expecting, a retiree to understand what links not to click on and what attachments not to open and things like that, right? There are people who have a lot more information and sophistication who can be helping to protect us all, rather than relying on some of the least informed, aspects of the players in the ecosystem. And I think there's a big consensus too that, for a period of time in cybersecurity and privacy, there was an attempt to do voluntary standards and convince the players in the ecosystem to live up to best practices and things like that, and that has really failed as a strategy. And so I think there's a growing consensus that there is time for government to play a more assertive role in mandating standards and regulating specific outcomes and incentives, and changing incentives to have better cybersecurity behavior. So those are all the positives, the tailwinds that the Biden administration has. I'd say the challenges are, of course, if you're talking about putting liability and responsibility on internet service providers and big software companies and things like that, they have more resources to push back than the retiree does, living in his or her apartment or his or her house. So that could be a political battle. It'll take some political will to get that pushed through. I think you see that the Biden administration's had some political will to do that, even though they haven't mandated certain software standards, for example, through legislation. They've enacted an executive order, which means if you want to do business with the federal government, you need to meet certain software standards. So they're using like the purchasing power of the federal government, which is a vast lever to pull to make the marketplace behave better in terms of software security. I think some of the other challenges that they're going to have is one of the pillars of the strategy is to disrupt and dismantle our adversaries. That's just really hard to do in this cybersecurity content. That remains an uphill battle. So as law enforcement, for example, if I needed evidence where there was a server in Russia, for example, that had evidence that I needed in order to prove a case, I just couldn't get to that because that government was not friendly with our investigations. I could not coordinate with Russian police to, bring down the perpetrators in that part of the world. And so I think Defend Forward is a recognition that we need to be doing more and pushing the boundaries, and not just sitting back and waiting for cyber attacks to happen, but actually getting in and disrupting adversaries is a difficult task, and we still have not cracked the code, and it's not really clear how it's going to be in sight for us to crack the code to make the risk-reward calculus for bad guys operating out of safe havens to continue to do their destructive activities. So those are some of the headwinds that I think the Biden administration is going to face.
I mean, clearly I see more themes that emerging from your remarks, the three of you. And one of the things that I have been seeing from your remarks is the emphasis on partners and allies and working together in the cyberspace. So my question to Alicia is, how do you see this mindset or policy trajectory changing post October 7th? Meaning we're seeing an uptake in cyber attacks. We are seeing companies releasing numbers, and clearly the numbers quadrupled, at least in the Middle East. So how do you see this landscape evolving?
Something to keep in mind is that, the investment made by the US government and US companies internally to address and adhere to new mandates, but also to proactively be partners. So we're seeing an increase in collaboration for cross-cutting cybersecurity issues across the government. We're investing in zero trust tools. We're investing in the cybersecurity mature model certificate from the DoD standpoint. And we're reinforcing this idea that the defense industrial base has to be liable and a partner, and being able to secure and provide trust in their products. But on the other end, we're also seeing private sector companies taking a leap of faith and addressing some of those concerns without being forced to do it. So Microsoft just announced a suite of security patches and efforts that they were doing following a report that highlighted some of the concerns from recent hacks into some elements of their systems. And what's concerning is, even though we're detecting these breaches, we're detecting these cybersecurity activities, we are having the hardest time to disrupt and further analyze how far our adversaries have been. That issue remains constant for not just the US, but international partners. And so that demand signal from the US and how much money is being invested, how much attention is being invested into these issues, is providing this guidance for partners to also follow suit and being able to invest in their own capability and protect their own critical infrastructure. And so we will see continuing growth in compliance, a continuing effort in sharing of threat and vulnerabilities. And the sharing of information is so much more important here. And CISA has taken the helm of this with international counter-ransomware groups. So, for instance, India is leading a subgroup on resilience with CISA. The UK is focused on safety, and there are other big partners that are really honing in. I think now you're seeing a cadence of probably once a week or every other week announcements of breaches and collaboration and new security guidance from joint agencies that are not just from the US. And so that's offering an opportunity for Middle East countries to come to the table and discuss those unified norms and being able to participate and share information and reinforce their systems as well, which is as critical as reinforcing our own system. And so all in all, the other opportunity, which will be mentioned later on, is also data security and post-quantum cryptography. So investing in emerging technology and tools to be able to face future threats. We are lagging a bit behind on protecting our current systems. Ransomware is rampant. It's very hard to disrupt and undermine ransomware attacks, and oftentimes it's easier to pay the ransomware than to go to the FBI and to coordinate and to not have access to your data. So to Naranja's point is there needs to be a continued shift from a location, from a specific tool approach to a value-based approach, which is data is a national security asset. Every single data point, from our healthcare to our social security number, to our travel information, to where we're staying in hotels, to national security operations, is so critical. And so focusing on how to protect that and where we need to continue to invest and where we need to continue to jointly collaborate, and having these big companies invested in the US, the Middle East, and having their infrastructure, their data centers, the physical and software aspect of data is going to be really important moving forward.
As always, brilliant. John, you are in the US government, now in the private sector. You are advising strategic clients and private equity firms. So you have a very interesting understanding of the intersection between both government and business. I'm asking for free advice here. What would be your main advice to business executives in tech companies that want to invest or expand in the Middle East? We have a region that a bit changing. We have a Microsoft G42 deal. We have Google making a push in the region. Clearly, there is more interest in the Middle East from a technology and cybersecurity standpoint. So what would be your risk-based advice to those executives? And if you have a business advice, I would also welcome that.
All right. Just remember what you paid for the advice when you're considering whether or not to take it. But obviously, for business leaders, they're going to have all the traditional factors about whether to about making decisions to introduce a technology product or something like that into a new market. So how well it will translate into that local culture and the consumer base and things like that. What the regulatory barriers are going to be to introducing that, the total addressable market, and all that sort of thing. About deciding whether or not to make an expansion. I think since the world is changing, we're not in the era of globalization anymore. So there's just more geopolitical and supply chain factors to think of these days than there was, maybe 20 years ago. So that all has to be thought through as well. And then there's a lot more to think about in terms of data and cybersecurity considerations than there was before as well. So companies will need to understand what's the regulatory environment that they're walking into if they're planning on, for example, it's a B2C or a business to consumer model, and they're planning on gathering a lot of individuals' information and making that a great big data lake with their other consumers across the globe. They need to be very cognizant of potential data transfer restrictions that have popped up in the last several years among different governments who are trying to protect their citizens' information from being, shipped off to different countries where it's outside their control. And there can be big penalties if companies are not mindful of that. They need to be understanding, what sort of risk exposure that they might be walking into. So if they're, for example, investing in something that's involved in critical infrastructure in Saudi Arabia, and Iran is an adversary of Saudi Arabia, they need to understand that their product or their company may be in the line of fire for that and subject to disruptive attack. Their ecosystem may be part of a cybersecurity attack, for example. So they need to understand what their risk landscape is going to be as well. So a lot more to think through than what you might have seen 20 years ago.
I mean, great advice.
Yeah.
Naranjan, again, I applaud you for the report. That was a fantastic document. We are very proud of it on the US cybersecurity strategy. I want to go down a bit on the rabbit hole of your understanding of the strategy in the context of the Middle East. I mean, we in the technology program at the Middle East Institute have been saying that the Middle East should not be seen exclusively through the lens of energy. We still believe. John, would be okay if you mute yourself?
Sure.
So we have been making the case that the Middle East is changing. There is a massive investment in critical technologies. We're seeing the UAE, we're seeing Saudi Arabia, from AI to 5G, Open RAN. So clearly the region is changing. So in the context of that digital transformation in the Middle East, what are the implications of the US cybersecurity for that region?
Sure. And Alicia unpacked these points quite well. But just to start out with, the emphasis that the strategy places on international partnerships, especially a lot of what you see in Pillar 5 on building global cyber coalitions, I think that presents a lot of opportunities to deepen technological and cyber involvement in the Middle East. So the US can help partners strengthen their cyber capacities, help expand intelligence sharing frameworks, collaborate on cyber operations and incident responses. So this could take the form of augmenting existing regional frameworks. So for instance, earlier in 2023, the Abraham Accords were expanded to also include a cybersecurity component. The US can also expand on some of the bilateral cyber partnerships in the region as well. So for example, the ones that it has with Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. And again, going to the threat of ransomware in the Middle East, a lot of the countries in the region are also involved with these global initiatives and global task forces. So Israel and Egypt and the UAE are involved in the counter ransomware initiative that the Biden administration recently has expanded with international partners. And another trend that you've highlighted, Mohammed, is the greater American regional investment in artificial intelligence and American tech companies establishing new data centers for their cloud services. And Mohammed, you've also covered this quite extensively in your work as well, but there's a lot of potential for the US to also expand digital trade with leading players in the region. So going forward, again, a lot of this really falls under Pillar 5, especially, but also in the context of the threat that the Iranian-based cyber actors and other cyber criminal groups have been recently posing, both to Israel and like the GCC states, as well as the accelerating digital transformation efforts across the region, and with Vision 2030. I do see American cyber and tech collaboration with the Middle East really accelerating and expanding in the coming years. At the same time, and I touched on this in the report at one point, but I do think the strategy's emphasis on the values-driven approach to cyber diplomacy, I do think that aspect of it could pose some potential challenges for the administration. So, for instance, a lot of governments in the region have been known to censor social media accounts more aggressively than you'd see in the West or with AI. There have been tensions with US and European policymakers in terms of the expansion of surveillance technologies. So we may not always see eye to eye with our partners in the region when it comes to what the report calls this big, broad vision of a free and open and unrestricted internet. But that being said, there are still some very important common approaches to these issues that the U.S. can build upon, and I don't see the U.S. foregoing relationships over these disagreements, especially as tensions with China heat up in the region. And I'd also add that the U.S. also has similar disagreements with data privacy and data localization with European and Asian partners. But I do think the Biden administration could struggle to reconcile some of the values-based components of its cyber strategy and the State Department's approach to cyber diplomacy with this inevitable need to cooperate with countries in the region over these shared threats. And I'd also add that it's not only important to consider how U.S. cybersecurity policy is going to impact the landscape in the Middle East. It's also important to consider how the geopolitical trends in the Middle East are going to impact U.S. cybersecurity priorities. So we discussed this on the previous panel about the cyber threat landscape in the aftermath of the Israel-Hamas war. So invite the audience to definitely check that out if they get a chance. But we've seen Iranian-backed actors attack U.S. water systems. They've also engaged with cyber influence operations against U.S. and Western academics with phishing campaigns. And even prior to the Israel-Hamas war, we've seen Iran expand its cyber influence operations. And there was also the hacking operation in the 2020 election. So to mitigate these threats, I think the U.S. should not only focus on expanding its tech collaboration and intelligence sharing efforts with partners in the region and expanding its technological footprint, but it also really needs to address these deficiencies at the domestic level in terms of its domestic digital ecosystem to improve the security of critical infrastructure technology and also make American election infrastructure more secure. Otherwise, our adversaries in the Middle East and elsewhere are going to continue to exploit these vulnerabilities.
John, you are not only one of the cybersecurity experts we have, but you also were in law enforcement. So the question I have for you is more on the intellectual side of things, which is what would be the possible ramifications of a more proactive cyber doctrine that more centric around defend forward, persistent engagement, and what you have called and others have called disrupt and dismantle foreign policy threats. The three of you have touched upon that before, but I think I'm very interested in the question of what does it do in terms of an actual cyber doctrine for the US government. We have been struggling with laying out a case to the American people about what's our own cyber posture. I think it's going to be very important for us to hear from you, your thoughts on that.
Sure. And just for the audience members who may not be familiar with terms like defend forward and things like that, that was, I made a little bit of a mention of it, but it's worth reiterating. Say 5-10 years ago, most of the time a cyber attack would hit a company and there would be absolutely no warning to that company that they were going to be attacked. So a lot of times they were not even aware that they were being hacked. And so that was a recipe for failure. What the government decided to do with policies like Defend Forward was to use the tools that we have. The US has some of the most effective offensive cyber capabilities amongst all the different nations out there, meaning we are able to infiltrate networks. We as the United States government are able to, and I'm not in the government anymore, but I still say we sometimes are able to infiltrate networks, cause damage, collect intelligence, disrupt adversary operations, things like that. And so Defend Forward is just leaning into that and saying we can't just sit back and wait anymore for bad things to happen. We need to be more proactive and get out there. So that had to happen. That Defend Forward had to happen. I think what you're seeing are some very useful things in terms of Defend Forward. So you're seeing better intelligence sharing and coordination amongst the government and the private sector, for example, even though that's never where people want it to be. That is making progress. So you're seeing better coordination with for example, with the FBI and ransomware victims. So if the FBI has infiltrated a ransomware group and they have information such as like the decryption key that a victim would need in order to unlock their data and get back to resuming operations after a ransomware attack, then the FBI is much better at coordinating with the private sector on things like that. And the US military is more proactive too about going out into adversary networks and providing some protection there. So some of the downsides, of course, even though I think that did have to happen, is some of the tools could be exposed that you use. So Stuxnet is a great example, going all the way back to 2011, where this very sophisticated software was released. All the public reporting says it was developed by US and Israel to impact the Iranian nuclear program and make the centrifuges in the program destroy themselves. So that was super, super effective until the tool was discovered. And now, it's like there's a lot of people who know how to make a Stuxnet type tool. So there's a potential boomerang risk with us being more proactive and pushing out forward, is that some of the sophisticated tools that we use, we could see coming back on us in ways that, we don't like and don't want to see happen. So that's one risk. The other is just that, our activity gets exposed and we get drawn into, if we're trying to provide discrete assistance to an ally or something like that, but our cyber activity gets exposed, then we are drawn more directly into a conflict and could get pulled into a conflict where maybe we don't really want to be super engaged, but the exposure of cyber activity can start to pull us in ways that we didn't want. So pluses and minuses to all of that.
This is great. I mean, Alicia, John, would be okay if you? Yep, fantastic. I have no idea why there's always an echo on Zoom. Alicia, it's election year. It's 2024. I have to ask a question about politics. I already asked John about Biden current challenges and Biden 2.0. I have to ask you on the other side, how might Trump 2.0 cybersecurity strategy would differ from the current Biden administration strategy? What elements would endure? What elements would change? And also, I mean, we have also in a unique situation, Trump 2.0, meaning that there was Trump 1.0. So what was actually the initial cyber posture that they maintain? John mentioned earlier that there's cybersecurity is more bipartisan. But I'm very interested to hear your thoughts about the nitty-gritty and details of the two different teams.
Yes, we can go first into Trump 1.0. A lot of the cybersecurity strategy efforts and tools and initiatives that we're seeing today is built up from years and years. So it started from Obama to Trump. Unfortunately, we've seen a slew of cybersecurity campaigns that have damaged critical infrastructure and cloud infrastructure, so SolarWinds, Colonial Pipeline, and a lot of greater ransomware attacks that are multiplying in the millions and billions of dollars. And that is a phenomenon of an acceleration of tech innovation. With AI, you're able to detect and create faster cybersecurity tools to be able to enter into zero-base vulnerabilities and other efforts. So it's nothing new and nothing groundbreaking. the Trump administration had a 2018 cybersecurity strategy from the DoD standpoint and others. It got solidified during the Biden administration. So I wouldn't say that one or the other can take the benefit. It's a mountain of efforts that's been consolidating. Now, what might be different for the next year ahead is not necessarily the strategy itself, but the implementation. So, as the US-based system is quite interesting, what will matter is who will be in Congress and when will the budget be released. And so we've already experienced a continuing resolution earlier this year and some leftover for the remaining of the year. If we do have a new administration under Trump, then we will see a budget request release way later than expected, which will delay and push back some key priorities, including cybersecurity. And it will slow down some of the ongoing efforts like zero trust, post-quantum cryptography migration, which was initiated in 2022, and other future forward efforts and defense forward efforts with Cyber Command. Right now, Cyber Command has great authorities, but it's lacking the digital workforce. Cyber workforce is something that we're lagging across the government. And so with a split Congress, we will see that slow down. Also, CISA has been a contentious issue on the Hill. There's been a lot of Republican lawmakers that do not believe in the mission or do not quite understand the impact of CISA, so they haven't been as strong advocates for increasing funding. So when you see a decreased funding in critical departments like CISA and the Department of Homeland Security, then you will see a decrease in actual implementation for efforts, and you'll see a decrease in international partnership, and you'll see a decrease in activity. That does not mean the activities will stop. It will just mean that it will slow down. And then you also see some contention around regulation. One conversation that's been happening behind the scene is, identifying new critical infrastructure sectors, because right now, what you're thinking of critical infrastructure, you're thinking water, energy, electricity. You're thinking, all Department of Energy related national laboratories and other sensitive areas. You're not thinking cloud infrastructure. You're not thinking software. You're not thinking of satellites. And so there is a concerted effort to discuss the implication of whether to include cloud and space as potential critical infrastructure, which would invite more regulations and mandate. Are those sectors, are we going to be able to mandate them? Is this realistic? What are the implications for the private sector, for commercial innovation? Will it hamper down innovation, or will it reinforce security tools? So that's something that might be different under Trump administration, the approach on regulation and the mandates. Right now, there's a lot of initiatives and efforts, as we've said before. The mandates are being proposed on the Hill, but we're definitely seeing a slowdown on actually enacting them in key legislative pieces.
I mean, to our audience, Elisha is one of my close advisors when it comes to understanding the House. So what you just heard is an expert explanation of why the question of funding is extremely important to implementation and policy. Narajan, one of the things that we're trying to do is simplify some of the cyber words, keywords that would sound like an enigma to the general audience. And one of the things that you lay out in your report about the Biden administration cybersecurity strategy is what they call shifting liability to dispositioned actors, realigning incentives and take more regulated approach to cybersecurity. So my first question is, who are these dispositioned actors? Like, how you define that? And how is the burden of cybersecurity likely to shift? In what terms? In terms of resources, in terms of human talent? I mean, give us lay of the land about that terminology and what does it mean in terms of policy implications?
Sure. So as I was mentioning earlier, and as both John and Alicia have really illustrated well in their responses too, is that the administration's calls to do what you just mentioned, so shape market forces, shift liability, realign incentives. That's really one major thing that's made the 2023 strategy stand out from the previous doctrines to cybersecurity. So the specific phrasing in the document was that voluntary adhesion to cyber defense has yielded inconsistent outcomes, and that market forces have not been sufficient to promote these security best practices. So as Alicia was saying, what the administration is instead embracing is a more regulatory approach, where the federal government would mandate cybersecurity requirements across different critical infrastructure sectors. And in terms of realigning incentives, the administration wants to actually start holding these best positioned actors accountable. So not just for security incidents and malpractice, but even for things like data privacy violations and misusing personal data. So here, when the administration is referring to best positioned actors, there are several groups or entities that can fall under this category depending on the specific context. So for critical infrastructure, it would be the owners and operators of critical infrastructure, of the operational technology that undergirds the facilities. And I'd say the other major set of actors the White House has in mind, as John was saying, are big and influential technology companies. So cloud service providers that manage the platforms and infrastructure that a lot of critical services and applications are hosted on, and globally distributed data centers, making them all the more important. And also vendors that develop and sell widely used software, or that's like an intermediary component of other tools and software. So this could refer to primarily big tech companies and large companies, but it could also apply to smaller and medium-sized companies if they manage and sell technology and software that, if compromised, can have really a large blast radius across the industry. So what the Biden administration is really striving for is, in this respect, is to shift the burden of these cyber incidents from the end users, from the open source project maintainers, and as the strategy states, the most vulnerable, onto the entities who are, in theory, more well-placed to actually prevent these bad outcomes from happening. So one major tenet of this vision is to pass legislation that would make it illegal for software companies to disclaim liability by contract, and thereby incentivize some software development security best practices and security principles like secure by default, secure by design. At the same time, and the challenging aspect of this is that the administration also acknowledges that there's a risk of unintended consequences of punishing well-intentioned companies and hindering the market too much with overly burdensome restrictions. So the way that the administration is navigating this is with something called a safe harbor framework. So that would shield companies that actually abide by these software development best practices, like the NIST Secure Software Development Framework. And the idea is to only hold companies accountable if they've been shown to be negligent of these standards. And if they're not taking these baseline agreed upon protocols to prevent these bad outcomes. So obviously a challenge here is developing the legal precedents. Hey, like what constitutes negligence? What does it mean to knowingly provide deficient or vulnerable software? And I think that's going to take several years and decades to really hash out and set precedents for. And Alicia was touching on this too, but I think it's also worth mentioning some of the challenges with respect to setting the cybersecurity requirements for critical infrastructure. So obviously there's the challenge, as was mentioned, with, well, how do you define different critical infrastructure sectors? And how do you harmonize regulations across critical infrastructure sectors, avoid duplications and inefficiencies? But there's also the problem of budgetary constraints and a lack of adequate investments. So that's something that's really been troubling for water facilities in the US. And we've also seen, in the case of the water sector, a lot of pushback from policymakers and industry groups. So I'd say going forward, if the Biden administration wants more success or a another administration wants success in actually putting some of these regulations into action, there's very much going to need to be some compromise with these lawmakers and industry groups to find some common ground.
Thank you, Niranjan. That was excellent. This is the last round of questions. I'll be very respectful of your time. If you're able to make it in 2.5 minutes, I would be very grateful. I will start with Alicia. Before the current push to regulate AI, we had a time when regulating data has been the most important aspect or the major point of discussion, policymakers and regulators. So connecting this to the current Biden administration cybersecurity strategy, what's the significance of data privacy in the context of cybersecurity, and how did the administration incorporate this in the strategy?
Yeah, I mean, data is a national security asset. The administration has recognized that and pushed a lot of effort besides the cybersecurity strategy to the data EO, the AI EO, which highlights the importance of public safety. So being able to opt in and out of certain tools, being able to protect your data. So long story short, it goes back to the national cybersecurity's tenets, which is resilience, security, and recovery. At the end of the day, ransomware, they're after your data to get money. Cybersecurity campaigns, they're after your emails, they're after your content. They want to use that for blackmail. They want to use this for monetary compensation. That's the majority of cybersecurity attacks. The more sophisticated ones are after specific national security information and tactics. And that's something that the administration is focused on. But the day-to-day ransomware, the day-to-day data stealing practices is also something that the administration is continuing to grapple with and struggle with, because I think the FBI releases every year ransomware report, and CISA releases how much they get reports from companies. It's over 1,000 a report a day on cybersecurity threats. So it's just not feasible, and so more needs to be done to protect your data.
Niranjan, back to you. I think now we are towards the end of our conversation. I want to make sure that there are some themes that we touch upon. And the most important one that I see here is how artificial intelligence and quantum, and with this level of development and deployment, going to impact the global cybersecurity scene from risk and opportunity.
Yeah, so this is really one of the major discussion points, and I guess really the million-dollar question in the cybersecurity domain currently. So I think, as you highlighted in the question, I think artificial intelligence is going to impact both offensive and defensive cyber capabilities. So one of the main ways we could see adversaries leveraging AI would be to analyze large quantities of data or large volumes of written code and find vulnerabilities that they could exploit, or find leaked credentials that they could later use to launch a cyber attack. Also evading cyber detection. We've also seen attackers using AI to launch sophisticated phishing prompts much more efficiently. And this is especially helpful with using large language models when there's a language barrier, which previously would have impeded these kinds of phishing operations across borders. At the same time, there are several AI and ML opportunities for defenders. So one way we're seeing this leverage is by finding errors and misconfigurations in code or in cloud deployment files. So helping software developers and say cloud platform administrators close off these attack vectors before malicious actors can exploit them. Again, another benefit is sorting through large quantities of data and audit logs to detect anomalous behavior. So this is very helpful in threat intelligence, but it's also been leveraged for expediting and enhancing the incident response and troubleshooting process as well. So in terms of whether it's going to favor offense or defense, I I think it's pretty hard to say. And I think the broader problem of offense, defense, and cyber security and cyber operations is in and of itself a pretty difficult question to answer. But I think a lot of it's going to come down to the efforts to increase research and development. So which side can make more progress in AI development over the long term, and also whether the U.S. and its partners can address some of the deficiencies with cyber expertise, technical expertise in the cyber workforce. I think that's also crucial here. And I think it's also important to consider, and this is something that the AI Executive Order and the European Union's AI Act are also emphasizing, are the attack vectors posed by the AI models themselves. So how do you prevent prompt injection attacks on these AI models? How do you prevent data poisoning? So working to establish frameworks and best practices for securing the AI models themselves, and not just considering how AI could be used for cyber offense or defense. With quantum computing, I would say it's a similar story. You have the ability to decrypt standard public key encryption algorithms and standards, but that's going to be far off. You need a lot more computing power and advanced technology than what's currently readily available with quantum at the moment. And at the same time, there's also a lot of research into post-quantum cryptography, preparing for a post-quantum future. So again, it's going to depend on whether quantum can be leveraged to build more secure and generating encryption keys that are much harder to break, whether that can be done before adversaries can leverage quantum for malicious purposes.
Thank you. John, last but not least, another free advice that I would seek from you. But in all seriousness, one of the things that are very important and we have been encountering in DC is the question of educating policymakers, elected officials on cybersecurity, AI, cloud computing, developing that sort of sense of cyber literacy and able to evolve with the times instead of just relying on the newspapers' headlines. So what resources that you would recommend to policymakers as someone who's in the private sector and used to work in the US government?
Sure. So I guess the first advice, the first thing I would say is, increasing technical acumen is achievable by anybody. I was a political science and history major coming out of college. So like, if I can do it, then anybody can do it. I'm certainly not the smartest guy in the world either. So if I can do it, then anyone can do it. I'd say number one is just a mentality by policymakers, and when they approach this, which is one to have some curiosity about it. It's a pretty interesting thing to learn. It can feel scary, but if people are curious, then they're more open to learning about a topic than if they're sort of petrified about it. Number two is to be patient. It's going to take a little while, and people have to give themselves some grace. And how much they pick up is never going to be 100% clear how much you need to know. And how much you don't, and where you stop, that sort of thing. So to have some patience, and then the third is just to be very engaged. So you can. There's a lot of resources out there. I won't name names, but there's a lot of basic level certifications that people can take to become more familiar with cybersecurity, AI, and other technology concepts. There's free courses out there, that are designed for non-technical audiences. Just learning platforms and things like that, where people can take small steps to where they can gain an understanding and get a sense of momentum, rather than trying to bite off everything all at once and feeling overwhelmed, giving up. And so there's a lot of resources out there where you could just take baby steps and make progress. All of those, and then to be engaged with the people around you. So if there's other policymakers who are, you can ask them how they're thinking about some of these issues, and asking technical people around you to if they're explaining something to you in a way that doesn't make sense, say, can you use an everyday analogy? I'm not getting that. Can you put that in everyday terms? That usually is wonderful, because my experience with going down the technology journey is that almost everything in technology has an everyday analogy to something else that people can understand. It's just being able to find that and to, sort of push the more technically savvy people around you to put it in terms that you can understand, that everyday analogies that help people understand and make better decisions. So those are some of my thoughts.
Worthy advice from an industry leader. I want to thank all of you, Elisha, Naranjan, John, for your time, sharing your insights. I know I had so many questions, but again, forgive me, this is a very important topic that I personally care about, and our audience do as well. I encourage all of our attendees to stay engaged with the technology program here at the Middle East Institute. We have reports and events, and please do not hesitate to reach out to me, to us, with your ideas and feedback. Once again, thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to continue these sort of conversations.